Hi, folks. Welcome. We'll give a couple seconds to let everyone join. We are happy to have you all here. Appreciate you taking out time from your busy schedules to join the webinar. Some important information that we are excited to share. So a couple logistics items before we get started. The webinar is being recorded and will be posted to the PeerTA website shortly. The PowerPoint will also be posted and made available to participants as well. We would like this to be an interactive session. I know that some of you have already submitted questions to our speakers. If you have additional questions during the presentation, you can use the Q&A box to submit those. There's an icon at the bottom of the screen for Q&A. If you have any technical issues, feel free to reach out to us in the chat box. And I think that's it. So without further ado, I will turn it over to Lauren.
Okay, thank you, Steve. And thank you everyone for joining today. This is a webinar to introduce you to the revised TANF Data Report instructions, also known as the instructions for forms ACF-199 and ACF-209. My name is Lauren Froelich, and I'm the Deputy Director of the TANF Data Division in the Office of Family Assistance. And so we'll get started. So the agenda for today is to give you some background on this effort and our goals for the revisions, to provide a timeline of the transition to these new instructions, talk a little bit about how this interacts with the new TANF data portal, and then to go through some of the substantive changes and other changes that we wanted to draw your attention to. Then we'll show you the instructions and forms and leave hopefully sufficient time for the Q&A. And so this webinar will go into high level but also technical details about the key changes in these revised instructions. We hope the webinar is helpful for staff working on federal data submissions in state and territory TANF programs. And we welcome questions during the webinar and afterwards. The instructions and forms can speak for themselves. They're very detailed, but we just wanted to have this webinar to be able to flag some of the most significant changes. And as Steve mentioned, we'll be sending out the slides after the meeting, and there are links within the slides as well, including to the new program instruction that has the new instructions and forms. And before we get started, we did want to get a sense of who we have in the audience. So we have a poll question here that should pop up that's just asking, what is your primary role related to TANF data reporting? Are you primarily responsible for preparing data, overseeing data reporting, realizing there might be a lot of overlap between those two, working on data IT systems, using TANF data for research and analysis, or other, none of the above. So please take a minute to respond. And then we'll see who we have in our audience. Okay, I think we can probably go ahead and close the poll. Can we see the results? Okay, thank you. So we've got a quarter of folks preparing data, 30%. Yes, there is not an option for multiple choice, unfortunately. So that's good and makes sense that people have multiple roles, working on IT systems, using TANF data for research and analysis. So really we have folks from all these different aspects of TANF data reporting, which is great. So hopefully this is helpful to you all. Okay, so the background for this effort, as you may know, is that these instructions for the TANF data report have not been changed really in over 15 years, since 2008. So there were a lot of things about the instructions that needed improvement or clarification, or just to be updated to reflect changes, not significant changes in the definition, but just to be a better tool for filling out these reports. Also, you may be familiar with our legacy system, the TANF Data Reporting System, or TDRS, which is even older, about 25 years old. And that system has limited our ability to provide real-time, timely feedback on the quality of data, which has led to confusion, understandably, from states, territories, and tribes on the status and quality of their data submissions. And so behind the scenes, the OFA and the TANF data division have had to do significant data cleaning, cross-checking, manual intervention, and spend a lot of time to really make the data serve the purpose that it needs to serve, which has several purposes, including the calculation of the work participation rate. So all of these factors motivated a more in-depth revision than had been done in a long time. And so our goals for this revision were to eliminate unnecessary data elements, clarify confusing instructions, all while minimizing the burden and costs to states. So we did that by taking extra care to substantively change as little as possible. So for example, we did not delete any data elements from the report layout, but instead changed them to item no longer in use, enter code 0. And the intent was to give states the option to skip these items that are not used for work participation calculations, reporting, or any other purpose without requiring changes to data systems. So if a state enters a code other than 0 for any of these items no longer in use, you will not receive an error for the most part, and that entry will simply be ignored. Now, there will be some exceptions or some feedback errors that will continue to build into the system, but that's sort of a general principle with these changes. And the only instances in which substantive changes were made were when the code options no longer made sense or created data integrity issues. So this webinar is really intended to be part of OFA's efforts to provide technical assistance and guidance around which of those data elements involve substantive changes. And so we really want to be transparent and proactive with guidance. We wanted to leverage the new platform for feedback with the TANF data portal, and I'll talk more about that. And then we also wanted to incorporate emerging best practices around inclusivity with data collection, and I will talk more about that as well. So here is a high-level timeline of how we got here. We spent a long time doing a very thorough revision. We consulted internally with the data policy and regional TANF staff. We had informal conversations with states, or just tried to get as much feedback any way we could informally. And then we also did research on best practices, like I mentioned. Then the instruments themselves went through the Federal Register Notice Paperwork Reduction Act process, where we got comments from several of you all that were incredibly helpful. It was part of a larger package of revised documents and forms that are outside of the scope of the presentation today. But just wanted to say we really appreciate the feedback that we got as part of that process. And so then now we are in what we're calling the transition phase. So you may note, and we did get a question to this effect, what do I do if data is already being collected and reported based on the old instructions? So we really are seeing this fiscal year 2024 as a transition. And states are not required or expected to make changes before halfway through this year, fiscal year 2024, Q3. And that's not to say you have to make changes by then, but we're not expecting, and I'll talk a little bit more about that kind of nuance or what's happening there. And then right now in this transition too, we're also transitioning to the new TANF data portal, which will offer new feedback based on these new instructions. And then in the next stage, which we're calling adoption for fiscal year 2025 and beyond, we will be refining data validation, focusing on data quality and continued technical assistance. And we'll be communicating a lot more about this transition and adoption stages, primarily through the TANF data portal. And so we do want to talk a little bit more about the TANF data portal, which some of you may be sick of hearing from us about, but we are very excited about it because, like I said, it's replacing a 25-year-old system. And for us, it's a really big deal and a big opportunity to better serve you all, to be a better repository for data and make that data more useful and higher quality. So the TANF data portal is the primary method for submitting TANF data reports starting now, as of now. And we've been using user research to improve the feedback and error reports that states receive to make them more meaningful, understandable, and accessible in Microsoft Excel. Those are still in development. So we're in this transition period. It's a little funny because you're still receiving the transmissions reports from the old system as we're developing the feedback reports in the new system. But so what the legacy edit codes are being replaced by in-app error descriptions with item numbers tied to data submission so that it's more clear where there's an error and why. And the data portal really provides an opportunity for faster and more helpful feedback. So like I said, in this transition period, states are going to continue to receive these older transmissions reports until there's a more formal switchover. All data that can be processed will be accepted by the TANF data portal in the transition. So one thing that we're moving away from is the idea of fatal errors, unless it is an error that really prevents a file from being processed. And the validation and the errors and the feedback in the new TANF data portal are reflecting these updated ACF-199 and 209 instructions that we're presenting here. But it's not going to reject a case or a record if it's using legacy values. It's just going to tell you that there's an error again, in an effort to help improve data quality. So with that, I'm happy to answer more questions about that later on in the presentation, but did want to get into some of the key changes we made here. So we're thinking about these in terms of some substantive changes and non-substantive. So substantive changes are ones that significantly change the meaning or coding options of an item. For example, combining two codes or eliminating one. And these are ones that, you're really gonna want to pay attention to. This isn't, like I said, this isn't something that's going to change tomorrow. You have this year to really implement. But so we did want to highlight what those changes are. And then there are some non-substantive or clarifying changes where we really were rewording or simplifying language used in guidance or instructions. It does not change the meaning of an item. And in a lot of cases, we were eliminating data elements and codes that are no longer in use. So that's hopefully part of an effort to minimize burden by eliminating unused items. We also, the instructions are quite unwieldy. So we moved these different narratives to the appendix. So there's still a lot of detail there, but it's just more streamlined so that you can get the key information you need when you need it. So the first change we wanted to highlight was around the work eligible individual indicator. So the way to read these slides is that the subtitle here is telling you where you can find this data element or item. So this is number 48 in TANF section 1 and number 41 in the separate state program maintenance of effort or SSPMOE section 1. And you can just see the old categories, the new categories. I'm not expecting you to be able to tell all the differences right off the bat. But what we did was we modified for clarity former code 11, which was not a work eligible individual, a non-recipient, non-custodial parent, is now under number 6. And then we added a new meaning to the old code 11 to fill a gap in information that was not available elsewhere, which is when an individual is a non-recipient, non-head of household, minor parent. Again, this is where we're getting pretty technical, but just wanted to call out where there are these sometimes subtle but important differences. We also collapsed code 10, a parent receiving SSDI, into code 8, which is a non-recipient parent also receiving SSI or AABD. So that's the work eligible individual indicator. The next one that is similarly cumbersome is work participation status. So we really dove deep into this one because we realized that the former old work participation status was really trying to ask a lot of questions. It was simultaneously asking, does an individual need to participate at the state level or the federal level? Are they participating in work activities, and are they meeting their required hours? And that is a lot of questions to try to fit into one data element or item. And so we really tried to distill into, okay, what information do we need to be able to calculate the work participation rate, time limits, other things that we use this for, and what don't we need? And another key point here is that participation and whether an individual meets requirements is determined by OFA based on hours reported, not on work participation status. So even though states in the old version on the left here had been asked to report, are they meeting the work rate? Are they meeting minimum participation requirements? That level of detail is not necessary for this question because it was already being determined elsewhere. So what we did was we collapsed all of those categories in orange, which are enumerated here, into one broader category, which is required to participate, and none of the above options apply. And then the other thing we did was clarify that number 7, which previously was exempt disabled, is actually an exclusion from the 2-parent rate, not an exemption, and that those individuals are still included in the all families rate. So that can be confusing. We had a lot of conversations about this, and we wanted to get out there and highlight this nuance here. Nothing has changed about the definition or what happens behind the scenes. It's just trying to differentiate in the instructions what we mean here. And so what you can see from this chart, which is really, again, all the orange categories are being combined into number 18 on the right. So what that means is if a state, and in the transition year, if you're reporting individuals as 10, 11, 12, 13, on OFA side, we're gonna all, combine those all into 18. So some of that work is gonna be happening where we're just making that connection, but ultimately the goal is for it to be simpler for states and clearer for us so that we're all on the same page. So this is really one of the more complicated revisions that we made. And this slide is another look at that same measure, but with a flow chart. And even though this still does look pretty complicated, I promise you it's much simpler than it was before. So trying to get at where are we breaking down work participation status, and again, the differences between what it means to be disregarded or exempt from the work rate. And obviously, work participation status and work eligible individual are really important definitions for the work participation rate. So we want to take these data elements very seriously, be as clear as possible, and provide the technical assistance to help make sure everybody understands what they're reporting here. So the next data element we wanted to draw your attention to is one that we did get a few questions about in the paper, the Federal Register notice process. So we the item disposition is no longer being used. So instead of telling us whether data collection was completed or not subject to data collection and a family was listed in error, we don't need to know that information. If a case was listed in error, it should not be reported and it should be removed when you resubmit that data. So that's really the gist of it. We're no longer reporting cases listed in error or not subject to data collection. And what that also means is that states should be submitting cases. States should still, if you are submitting a sample of your caseload, you should still submit enough cases to have a sufficient sample size. And that has always been true. We're just trying to make that as clear as possible. So we need a random sample of those who would not be listed in error. And so ideally, cases listed in error would be excluded before you sample, and you should sample more than the minimum required cases each month in order to maintain a sufficient sample when such cases are removed. Again, this isn't a change in policy, it's just trying to be as clear as possible, and removing this this need to tell us whether it's listed in error, because we don't need to report that. The next item is on gender. And so this is one when I mentioned that we were doing the best we could to have our data collection reflect inclusivity. So we had gotten questions and had been thinking a lot internally about how to have the gender question on the data report reflect more than male and female, and what those other options should be. So you'll see on the right, we have the new options: male, female, non-binary, or gender non-conforming, uses a different term, or unknown or refused, prefer not to say. And so we added these three options. We also wanted to accommodate states' varied options. We did get some good feedback here on what states are already doing. We really appreciate throughout this process what you all may have shared with us about whether you're thinking about making changes, whether you've already made changes. and that we tried to accommodate that with these new options. Now, if your state has not made any changes and does not plan to, and will continue to only ask male or female, you can still respond to this question, but this is an encouragement to think beyond, and to also, this is informed and following cross-government recommendations. There was an executive order with sexual orientation and gender identity best practices. There was a report from the National Academy of Sciences. HHS and ACF are doing their own efforts around this. So there's really a lot of work thinking about this that we tried to incorporate here. And I will say, one of the best practice that we saw a lot of places was to actually have a two-step question. But here is where we were limited in not wanting to add a data item that would require more substantial changes to IT systems. And so we were limited to one question here. Okay, and then the next one, this is a smaller one, but for subsidized housing, in discussing this item, we wanted to simplify it to allow for more types of subsidized housing. So instead of having to distinguish public housing or rent subsidy, it's just yes, subsidized housing or no. But we did want to highlight this because this is a case where the codes themselves have changed meaning. The next one here is receive subsidized childcare. So there's a series of elements where the question is receive subsidized childcare, yes, yes or no. And then the following question is what is the amount of childcare they received? So instead of having that be a two-part question, this item, receive subsidized childcare, is no longer in use. And instead, it is determined by amount of subsidized childcare, which is the following code in each of, or following item in each of these sections. So previously, this had been a source of discrepancy. So data reports would say, yes, they received childcare, but then there would be no amount, or the other way around. So this is an effort to streamline that. We only need to know if there's an amount, yes, they received childcare subsidy, and use that logic. We did want to flag this because this is one area where entering 0 for item no longer in use would currently cause a fatal error in the TDRS system. So as we're transitioning to the TANF data portal, that won't be an issue, but that's part of the reason why we want to make that transition around August 2024 in the third quarter of fiscal year 2023. There are only 2 instances here and another one where that is really an issue, but we did just want to flag that, and happy to answer more questions about that. A few other changes, we're close to the end here. Family affiliation, simplified and clarified the language and refined it for each section because there are different rules and different options according to the different sections. Just a flag that for cooperated with child support, not applicable, used to be 3, now it's 9 to match TANF. So we did a lot of work looking across sections, trying to make them more consistent when it made sense. Here, relationship to head of household, we reduced code options for simplicity, also made more consistency across sections. And this is another one where the new instruction for children whose family affiliation code is 4, it's optional, enter 00. But that is something that would get you a quote unquote fatal error in TDRS. So that's something that we just want to flag, and that the TANF data portal will not be an issue, but you don't have to rush to make this change. For receives disability benefits, again, we removed codes no longer in use, worked for more consistency across sections, and combined 2 codes. And those are really the key changes. I hope, as technical as that got, I hope you can see that the changes are really minimal, certainly minimal from an IT system standpoint, that the new TANF data portal is going to be accepting of the legacy values. You're just going to start to see those errors and an attempt to push towards higher data quality to conform to the new instructions. So the program instruction for this new instructions and form is available on our website. We can share that link. You'll see that they look a little bit different. So here, the little preview of the instructions on the right, we have a table of contents. We've tried to clean up the formatting a lot, should be easier to navigate. So hopefully that's all helpful. There are some general instructions and the appendix that I mentioned. And then on the left, instead of sort of what we used to have, which kind of looked like a paper form that you could print out, now we've combined the form with the layout, file layout. So it should be clearer to see all the different items, item number, description, length, the place within the file, the data type, and then an example of the contents. And we've also indicated there where a code is no longer in use and you should be entering 0 or 1. And so we hope that these will be useful tools and more helpful than they were previously. And so with that, thank you all for listening. Happy to open it up to questions through the Zoom, through the Q&A box and or the chat. We are, based on, depending on interests, we're happy to do a follow-up webinar or office hours explaining any of the changes if you have questions. And we would love to hear what would be most helpful for you. You know, we'll make these slides available. We've also been working on a sort of a code book of all of the data elements that could be crosswalked with what the changes are. So if that's something that would be helpful, we can continue working on that. But in the meantime, I will stop there and yeah, happy to open up to questions. Okay, and I see. Okay, so we have one question in the question and answer. Do we still need to follow the instructions for dropping a case, or will we just not report a dropped case? So that goes back to the disposition. You just don't need to report a case if it's dropped, but you do need to, like we said, ensure that there is a sufficient sample size after dropping those cases. Yoon or Alex, is there anything you'd like to add to that?
That was correct.
Okay, thank you. Okay. Then we have the question, is there any change to the WPR rate calculation that happens behind the scenes using the section 1 file submitted?
I can answer that question. No, wouldn't change the work participation rate calculation.
Yeah, and Yoon knows that best if she's calculating those work participation rates. And kind of like I said, all the changes are places where kind of reflecting what changes were, not changes, but trying to be more transparent with what information is actually needed to go into the work participation rate. So there's more of we're just asking what we need to know to calculate that. Okay, there's a question here about FTANF software. Will there be an updated version of FTANF?
Would you like me to take that?
Sure, you can take that.
Hi. So currently, the plan is to get to a place where we can build that functionality into our new system, TDP. But for right now, as long as FTANF is working on your side and your system infrastructure, you're welcome to continue to use that. But over time, we will be replacing that.
Yeah, FTANF is another one of those legacy tools that has not been supported and is not, current with modern technology. So like Alex said, we're looking in how to replace that functionality in the TANF data portal. But because we've designed this in a way to not be incompatible with the old way of doing things, you can continue to use it.
I can answer the race and ethnicity question. Right now, we don't have the options, but if a state didn't choose any of the options, so we consider it as unknown.
Yeah, so with race ethnicity, that's one where we already have it. So it's, set up as, are they Black or African American? Yes or no. Hispanic? Yes or no. So you're saying if they answer no to everything, that's essentially saying unknown.
That's correct. So if I choose more than one yes, we consider as multiracial.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Okay, we have, if states are resubmitting historic data, will TDP accept files with aligning with current historic formatting? Yes. We do not expect you to go back and change any historic data based on these instructions, and TDP will continue to accept those. As we talked about in the adoption stage, FY 2025 and beyond, we're going to keep refining that data validation. And if there comes to be a point where certain legacy values are kind of phased out or would be kind of more glaring errors, we'll communicate that. But one fundamental change with TANF Data Portal is that we're not going to have those fatal errors that you just have no way around. So you're going to get errors and feedback, but that doesn't mean you can't submit the data in a historic way. Okay. Going through these. When will the new file formats be shared? States need time to review and request changes in their eligibility systems to capture the data correctly. So the forms, these are available, and we can put a link to the PI in the chat. But the forms are available, which is essentially the file format. This is all live on our website as of today. Okay, and I'm trying to keep up with, okay, so we've got, will the new requirements be due for the file submitted for quarter, April, May, and June file that is due August 14th? Yes. So that's going back, and I do want to go back here to the timeline. And so, there's this transition period where two main things are happening at once. We have these new instructions with some of these coding changes that we went over that are being rolled out in this year, simultaneously, we're moving from TDRS to the TANF data portal. And because those two things are happening at once, it gets a little bit tricky, but that's why we're really seeing this year as a transition year. So you're certainly not required or expected to make any changes before August 14th, 2024. And then, but you're also, if it takes longer than that, the TANF data portal will still accommodate. You're just going to start to see more of those errors, but that doesn't mean those records aren't captured in the database. Anything, Alex, you'd want to add to that?
No, got it. I was in the middle of answering another question related to TDP, which I can answer live too.
Yeah, go for it.
So one question that we have here is related to being able to resubmit data prior to 2021 through the fiscal year 2021 through TDP. Right now, that's not currently a plan for us because those fiscal years have closed. But there are scenarios where some states need to resubmit old data because of an audit, a state audit of some sort, and we will consider those on the case-by-case basis. So it's possible, but it's not currently a plan.
Yeah, and if you you need to resubmit older data, please don't hesitate to reach out to us and we can talk about options. And I'll just put this back up here. TANF data at acf.hhs.gov goes to all of us, which is the TANF data team, and we'll do our best to help you there. So so I see the question, when can we get that crosswalk, start planning our transition work and budget? So we can, I don't have an exact timeline for that. We can certainly work on rolling that out soon. I will say that the information you need in terms of what are the substantive changes, this is it. It's these data elements that are highlighted in the presentation. Those are really the key ones, but I do understand why you would want the comprehensive list. But we actually started the crosswork effort after getting a question from a state in the Federal Register notice process, where they had gone through and said, these are what we think the changes are. And we realized we needed to be clear that there are a lot fewer changes than you might think. And so we can work on sharing that out more broadly and getting that to you. Yeah, totally understand you want as comprehensive a list. You don't want to have to keep going back to your IT systems. Are there other questions from the chat that I'm missing?
Lauren, did you get the T4 and T5 question?
And someone asked T6. Yeah, can you answer?
Sure.
Yeah.
So T4 and T5 is a reference to the TANF closed section, and there are some changes there as well. Some of the data elements, as you may already be familiar with, are similar or the same as in TANF section 1, for example. Particularly the person level data elements, and we've tried to make those changes consistent across sections. There have not been any changes to the T6 record, which is a reference to TANF section 3.
Okay, so I'm seeing a lot of interest in that crosswalk, and follow-up session. one thing we could try to do is have that crosswalk ready for the follow-up session so that we can also go through it then. Okay. Any more questions? Okay. Great. Well, thank you all for coming on this journey with us. You can use the old format for the first 3 quarters. So when we say August 2024, that would be for the 3rd quarter of fiscal year 2024. But you can use the old format for the first 3 quarters. It's just you could also transition to the new format for that 3rd quarter. So there's sort of, that was a confusing way to put it, but those last 2 quarters, you can use either, both will work. The presentation was recorded and will be posted on the PureTA website later. And the slides will also be shared. We can share out the links to the instructions and forms. Oh, did we get that in the chat? Let's make sure to do that. Someone from the data team, can you please share the link in the chat to the PI? Thank you, Thomas. Okay. Well, thank you all for joining. We'll get to work on cleaning up the crosswalk so that it's ready for you and scheduling that follow-up conversation. But we appreciate all the questions, also all the feedback that helped us get to this point. And to the question, Gail's question in the Q&A, the old format will still be acceptable after the 3rd quarter. You'll just start seeing more of those errors. Okay. Thanks, everyone.